Welcome back. We now reach the deepest question in the whole field, and one of the most important studies for answering it. Heath, Macciochi, Micheli, and Ringenberg from 2023. The question is this: does socially responsible investing actually change how companies behave? The researchers separated two things that are almost always confused. First, do socially responsible funds select cleaner, more responsible firms? And the answer is yes, they genuinely do tilt toward better behaved companies. But second, and this is the crucial one, do they cause those firms to improve their behavior? And here the answer is no. The good behavior was already there. The funds picked companies that were cleaner to begin with, but their ownership didn't make those companies any cleaner afterwards. In the author's framing, it's selection, not transformation. Let me give you the phrase to remember because it captures the entire tension of sustainable investing in 5 words. Picking good firms is not the same as making firms good. A fund can assemble a lovely portfolio of virtuous companies and feel thoroughly sustainable, while having zero causal effect on the total amount of good in the world. It just concentrated the existing good in its own portfolio. And this points, once again, to the same conclusion the whole course keeps reaching. The real impact channel is engagement, actively changing what firms do, not screening, merely choosing what you hold. This distinction, selection versus transformation, is worth pausing on because it's so easy to feel it's just splitting hairs. It isn't. It's the whole ballgame for anyone who genuinely cares about impact. Suppose the world has a fixed number of clean and dirty companies. If sustainable funds simply buy the clean ones and shun the dirty ones, the total amount of clean and dirty business in the world is exactly unchanged. You've just sorted the existing companies into different portfolios. The dirty companies still exist, still pollute, still find owners happy to take the higher returns. For the planet, nothing happened. Real impact requires either creating new green capacity that wouldn't otherwise exist, or pushing existing dirty companies to actually clean up. Screening does neither. That's why serious impact investors talk obsessively about additionality, and why the industry's favorite, most scalable strategy is, from the planet's point of view, close to a placebo. That conclusion gets powerful reinforcement from Berk and van Binsbergen, whom we met in Part 8 in their pointed analysis of impact investing. Their core finding is quantitative and sobering. Divestment and ESG screening have only a tiny effect on firms' cost of capital. Far too small to change cost of capital. Far too small to change the real investment decisions those firms make. The logic is the one we've built up throughout. When you refuse to hold a brown company, someone else buys it, so its share price and its cost of raising money barely move. And if a company's cost of capital doesn't change, then nothing in its actual behavior has any reason to change either. Their prescription follows directly. To have real impact, investors should engage and change what firms do, not just reshuffle who owns them. This is a genuinely sobering benchmark to hold up against the grand impact claims of the sustainable asset management industry. Trillions of dollars are marketed on the promise of making a difference. Yet the most careful analysis says that the dominant tool, screening and divestment, barely moves the needle. It's not that sustainable investing can't have impact. It's that the specific, cheap, scalable methods the industry most relies on are the ones least likely to. So if screening barely works, is there any good news? Yes, and it's the mirror image. If divestment is the weak lever, engagement is the strong one, and we have solid evidence for it. Dimson, Karakas Li, whose work we saw in Part 8, found that successful ESG engagements earn around 7% cumulative abnormal returns over the following year. Engagement, when it succeeds, creates real value. And they identified when it's most likely to succeed for credible, well-resourced investors, and particularly on governance issues, where the path to improvement is clearest. There's more. Azar and co-authors found that the engagement of the Big Three is statistically associated with lower carbon dioxide emissions at their portfolio firms. Direct evidence that the giant universal owners, when they do push, can move real-world outcomes. So active ownership genuinely can create value and cut emissions. But notice the and cut emissions. But notice the tragic shape of this whole chapter. Engagement works, yet it is costly and, as we established, structurally undersupplied because the mostly passive, fee-competing industry has weak incentives to pay for it. We have found the lever that works. The problem is that almost no one has enough incentive to pull it hard enough. That structural tension, a working tool that's chronically underused, leads us into Part D: regulation, duty, and the future of the industry. If the market won't supply enough genuine stewardship on its own, the natural question is whether law and regulation can push it to. And here we run straight into one of the most dramatic developments in all of sustainable finance right now: a fierce political backlash that is pulling Europe and the United States in opposite directions. Start with a foundational legal question: fiduciary duty. An asset manager has a legal duty to act in question. Fiduciary duty. An asset manager has a legal duty to act in its client's best financial interest. So the core question is, may a manager consider ESG consistent with that duty? Or stronger still, must it? And here the two sides of the Atlantic have arrived at almost opposite answers. In the European Union, the law increasingly says managers must integrate sustainability risk into their process and must ask clients about their ESG preferences. That's built into the SFDR and into MiFID II. In Europe, considering ESG is becoming part of doing your job properly. In the United States, by contrast, the picture is chaotic. The Department of Labor rule governing whether pension managers may consider ESG has flip-flopped with each change of administration. Permitted under one president, restricted under the next, then loosened again. So we have the remarkable situation where the very same activity, a manager weighing climate risk in a pension portfolio, is treated as prudent risk management on one side of the Atlantic and as a potential breach of duty on the other. Same activity, opposite legal framing. For a global asset manager, that's a genuine headache, and it's a symptom of how politically charged ESG has become. Let's look squarely at that backlash, because it's reshaping the industry as we speak. In the United States, ESG has become intensely politically polarized, and several Republican-led states have moved against it. Texas, Florida, and others have restricted or boycotted asset managers they see as hostile to fossil fuels. Concretely, Texas pulled investment mandates and placed BlackRock on an official divestment list, and Florida withdrew around $2 billion from BlackRock's management. The message to managers was blunt: appear anti-fossil fuel and you'll lose our business. And the managers responded. They softened their ESG language, quietly walked back some commitments, and backed fewer ESG shareholder proposals, exactly as we saw in the proxy voting data. Meanwhile, United States sustainable funds have suffered more than 9 consecutive quarters of net outflows. Step back and take in the significance. For most of this course, the political winds have blown in favor of sustainable finance. Here, for the first time, we see a powerful, organized, and effective push in the opposite direction. ESG in the United States is no longer just a financial question. It's a front in the culture war. And that political reality is now doing something the academic critiques alone never could. It's forcing the industry to retreat. There's a genuinely fascinating irony buried in this backlash that I want you to appreciate. The anti-ESG movement accuses managers of pushing a political agenda through their investments, of putting climate ideology ahead of returns. But the managers' defense is precisely the opposite. They argue they consider climate only as a financial risk, a matter of prudent long-term investing, not politics. So both sides are, in a sense, fighting over the boundary between finance and values that we drew way back in Part 8, the pecuniary versus the non-pecuniary. The critics say ESG is smuggled in values masquerading as finance. The managers say it's just finance. And the honest truth, as this whole chapter shows, is that it's often genuinely both, tangled together, which is exactly why the fight is so bitter and so hard to resolve. When climate risk really is financially material, just good investing and pushing a green agenda can look identical from the outside. Let's recap. The deepest evidence is humbling. Socially responsible funds select good firms but don't transform them. Selection, not transformation, and divestment barely moves the cost of capital. Engagement is the one lever that genuinely works, earning around 7% on success and cutting emissions when the big three push, but it's costly and undersupplied. And on regulation, Europe and the United States have split. The EU mandates ESG integration through the SFDR and MiFID II, while a fierce American backlash, divestment lists, billions withdrawn, quarters of outflows, drives managers to retreat. In the final video, we cover the collapse of the Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, take a quick look at hedge funds, and draw the whole chapter together. See you there.